It's my great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Ophelia Deroy. Ophelia and I knew each other since 2010 in New York. Back then, she was already famous for her work in synesthesia, in multisensory integration, and so on. And later, she moved to London, and I secretly followed her in 2012. And we overlapped for 5 years. We had really good time in London, the Institute of Philosophy, the Senses, and so on. But then she moved again to Munich, where she's at. And I thought about moving, but then I thought that's probably too much for my PhD. So I stay in London, but I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to have her speaking a very interesting topic to us. So let's welcome Ophelia.
Okay, great. So I wanted to say first, what a great pleasure it is to be here. And of course, now I need to go back to my slides. And this was working, so it says. And yeah, I wanted to put together, actually, especially for this event, a few stream of research that have been conducted with colleagues across philosophy and cognitive neuroscience on perception, and especially one aspect of perception that has kept puzzling me through the year. But because I can't do a big summary, I wanted just to start with a sort of anecdotal case of the kind of phenomena that interests me. It's a video that actually is famous for something else, that it's one of the most viral videos on the internet. It has more like 8 million views. And if I manage to activate it, maybe you have seen it. It's known as Double Rainbow. And this was filmed by, you will see an individual from his camera. And here's Paul Bear, who lives in the Yosemite Park and watches a rainbow. So I just let you.
Double rainbow, all the way. Double rainbow, oh my God. It's a double rainbow all the way. Whoa, that's so intense. Whoa, man.
So I let you go on, and it goes on and on. At some point, actually, he starts believing that this is a sign of God that has sent the rainbow to him. But what's interesting here, it's an illustration of the phenomenon that I'm interested in. And it's, I want to try and think about different ways. Of course, it's just an anecdotal case, but different ways in which we can think about this case. So clearly, it's not your canonical case of perception where, you and I would be just seeing a double rainbow, and the rainbow feels like, yeah, it's there, and we are perceiving it. So call this the cases where things feel normally real, and it's really a case of perception. It's also not a case where you're imagining a rainbow, a case where you close your eyes or you're daydreaming and you think, how nice would it be if there was a double rainbow? Cases where there wouldn't be a double rainbow, but also that imagining wouldn't feel that real. One way in which you could think about it is a case of what you could say a confusion between imagination and perception. That is a case where actually he's hallucinating a double rainbow. There is no double rainbow. But somehow it feels real, and therefore is hallucinating a double rainbow. But we have to admit that this is not the case here. Why? Because he's actually filming that double rainbow. He's thinking that there is a rainbow to be filmed with his, and you don't do that if you're imagining. That's And it sort of doesn't fit the corresponding objective description because there is a reality matching. Now, it's not a case then of confused imagination where you take your product of imagination for reality. That's still, if you look at what people have been looking at in the philosophical and empirical literature, that's usually these cases that they focus on. That is the cases where you confuse something that is purely imagined for something that is actually real, right? It's known as hallucination. When it's a strict case, that is a case where it's fully something which is internally generated, and yet it's subjectively taken as real. That's the canonical definition of an hallucination. And we know that there are cases like this from the clinical literature in schizophrenia, for instance, but there are other cases. You can pick your favorite one. Phantom limbs might be like that, where you're just making things up, but you feel that you have a limb, although you've been amputated. Philosophers have been talking about the problem of hallucination for a while. And of course, we know from many pop cultures and movies that, there's this idea that maybe we're just imagining this world, and actually it just feels real, but it's not real. So that's the case of confused imagining that occupy a lot of the philosophers. It's true that recently other kinds of confusions have been documented, not cases where you're purely imagining something and you consider that it's real, but cases where you're both presented with something in reality and sort of imagining something at the same time, and the two tend to blur together, so it's not really clear whether the end product is the result of your imagination or the result of your perception. For people who are familiar with the old cases, they were known in the literature as the Perky cases, documented by an American psychologist. And the cases where this was done in the 30s, so they looked like that. Perky invited participants in the laboratory, and they were asked to just sit and stare at a white wall and imagine various things. For instance, imagine the skyline of Manhattan. So people would imagine that. But in a subtle way, as she reports in the paper, she would present other pictures on the screen at very, very low level of luminosity, very low threshold. It's not very controlled, so it's just reported more qualitatively. And then what happened, she says, is that people reported imagining the skyline of Manhattan, but if she was projected, for instance, a red circle, they would imagine Manhattan at sunset. So that's a case of mixing, where there is something which is perceived on the wall, while the subject is involved in an imagination episode, and then the two content gets blurred, right? So that's an interesting case of mixing, and there's really beautiful work coming out at the moment from Steve Fleming group and Nadine Gispla work, for instance, where they have actually conducted the equivalent of this Perky experiment, but this time with very controlled stimuli, with Gabor patches, asking participants to actually imagine a Gabor patch in a certain orientation. And then when they project a Gabor patch in the same congruent orientation, people are faster at detecting the presence of that patch than when they imagine an incongruent Gabor patch. So there is this interplay between imagination and perception in these mixed cases. Now, I really don't want to say that mixing imagination and perception and trying to think about the reality of the resulting product is not a serious issue. There is indeed a lot of overlap between imagination and perception. So this is again a recent TICS paper by Gispla, where they looked at the overlap between areas involved in imagining and perception. So on the left, they looked at 4 regions of interest in the visual pathway. And you see that basically you have either the amount of overlap between imagination and perception, and it's very low in the early visual areas, but as you get upstream in the object areas, then you see a lot of overlap. And the same is represented here at the level of the whole brain. So you have the overlap between perception and imagery in the reddish color. And this is also correlated with how vivid an imagining the person tends to have. So the vividness of imagery, which we heard about earlier on, is actually also correlated with this overlap. Now, we've also heard a lot about this interplay between perception and expectation. So it's true also that we've moved away from the idea that perception is purely externally generated. There's a lot of internal generation that is going on through memory, through expectations, top-down influences. So this is really a serious aspect, and epistemically also very serious. If I'm not capable of saying which part is coming from me and which part is coming from the external world, then I might take for granted or accept as true something that actually I've made up. So I really want to pay credit to this type of what we can call the classical problem of distinguishing between imagining and perception. But actually, I want to say that there is also a new problem of perception that is presented by the video we started with. Why? Well, because obviously, as I said, this is not a clear case of perception. This is not a case where there is a double rainbow and the perceiver just sees it calmly and says, oh, I see a rainbow. It's also not a case of confused imagination when there is no rainbow and either he's totally confused and says, oh, I'm certain there's a rainbow, or is slightly wondering, is there a rainbow or not, right? This is not the product of his imagination. What I want to argue and convince you of is that there is a third category of cases here, which I propose to call extraordinary perception. And they correspond to cases where it's not the same type of confusion. There's still a confusion going on, but it's within perception itself. So to go back to the table, when you're in the case of imagination, there is no exact match in reality for the imagining. But here we're clearly in the case of perception. There is still a match with reality. There is a rainbow out there that you should perceive. But there is, like asymmetrical, there is a difference in the feeling of reality. That is, it doesn't feel as real as perception, right? So here again, what you had here is that there is no objective reality, but it feels real in the wrong way. Here there is an objective reality, and it sort of feels real, but also in a confused way, not as real as it should. Right? So if that asymmetry is clear, let me try and convince and tell you more about why we should consider extraordinary perception. That's the formal definition of the phenomenon, which is a case which has this arguably sort of paradoxical three features. One, as I said, it says a clear perceptual nature. Otherwise, we cannot explain why someone like Paul, who's filming, is actually taking his camera. If he thinks that this is an imagining, he wouldn't take his camera. We also know that this is actually corresponding to an actual double rainbow. So it's not a case where he's confused between perception and imagination. There is no such thing out there. So he's taking his camera, and he's right to take his camera because there is really a double rainbow out there. But there is this middle thing that remains difficult to explain. It seems not to believe his experience, not to be able to accept that this is really a double rainbow that he's seeing. He keeps questioning, he keeps sort of inferring that this is some surreal aspect of his experience. So there is a confusion of his sense of reality within perception itself. So, as I said, it's not a case of a mixing in the sense that, of course, there's still the role of memory or expectation, but we cannot say here that this is a deviant chain. It's not coming from a wrong case. It's just a classical case of perception. If we consider this as imagination, then everything goes down as imagination. Okay, so if there are such cases that can be exactly capturing reality, but not feeling appropriately real, then we are in a case of extraordinary perception. As I said, it's a question in many cases I want to argue of charity principle, that we have to describe these cases as extraordinary perceptions, such as the case of filming and checking, for instance. People take their experience to be real or they wouldn't film or check. But I think there are also, there's also other reasons to have this category, because it covers cases that otherwise get sort of neglected in the literature. There, and this is partly what has inspired me to look at this, is all the cases of the weird perception that people test in multisensory cases. So for anyone who is familiar with the literature, what you do in many experiments in multisensory perception is that you introduce a spatial gap or temporal delay between, let's say, an auditory stimulus and a visual stimulus, or a tactile stimulus and a visual stimulus. Your brain still puts the two together, and you're not thinking you're imagining this thing. It's clearly a case where you think you're perceiving these things, but it feels not exactly right. And that's something that's, because a lot of the psychophysics and the neuroscience is not trying to capture the phenomenology, the idea that you find in the literature is that it perfectly feels as if it's as real as the cases when there is no temporal or spatial gap. But interestingly, when you ask people to compare, they will tell you that they have perceived the same thing. They have, let's say, perceived the McGurk syllable. But if you ask them to pick which one is fishy, they will be above Cheng picking the McGurk case. Interestingly, at least not people with schizophrenia, but that's something we can go back to. So there is something in this sensory conflict where you're still convinced that you're perceiving something. You're sort of right that these things have occurred, they're very correlated, but there is a feeling of weirdness. There are other cases like that in derealization as well, where people who have a syndrome of derealization, it's this kind of feeling you have when you're walking and then you feel you're a bit like in a movie. You look at your experience and you're not thinking I'm dreaming or I'm imagining, you're clearly perceiving. Things are considered perceptual, but there is something strange in your feeling of reality. It's a bit like surreal. Right? Again, that's another case that can occur more often with people suffer from derealization. Then there's another type of cases that are interestingly like this. It's cases what are called of extra pattern perception. So on this, I just go. Yes, these are the cases of multisensory perception I was thinking about. But here's something that I want to explain, correspond to this extra pattern perception. So I do a lot of sailing. I spend a lot of time on boats. And whenever I'm sailing with people who don't sail and I'm with people who sail, there's this moment where there is something in the movement of the boat and the sound on your inside that doesn't feel right. There's something that you start thinking and there is a pattern here that people with certain expertise are picking on. But then if you ask the others, they think we are making it up. They say, no, it's perfectly fine. It's exactly, do you hear this? No, that's not. It's this kind of interesting aspect of pattern perception that there is, for some people, you really think this is a pattern, you're picking it up, it feels real, but then other people deny that it's there. And you might start thinking, am I really getting this or not? So it starts to decrease or question your sense of reality. But at the same time, you're quite convinced that there are sounds and things that you're picking on outside. again, this is not just anecdotal. So in a 2016 paper, actually the group with Hugo Critchley and Sarah Gerfinkel looked at pattern perception in traders on the London trading floor. And they figured out that actually the very successful traders tend to pick up on patterns before others. And it's linked to their interoceptive awareness. But there is a moment where they think this is the moment to sell or to buy. And they're just bombarded with a lot of visual information and background noise and so on. Again, what you want to say is that you need to put yourself in the shoes of the trader at that stage where you're perceiving all these things on the screen. You have the sense that you're perceiving a pattern, but there is this moment eventually of awareness where nobody else seems to be seeing it. And yet you decide to act on it. So there is something that seems real to you, but other people will not see, and therefore might make you a bit uncomfortable regarding this reality. But it's not as if suddenly you necessarily start thinking, I'm imagining it, otherwise you wouldn't press to actually sell or buy. So that's again this kind of paradoxical dual signature where you both have signs that you take it as perceptual, but there is something fishy within your perception that you're questioning. Still some weird. And finally, cases of extraordinary perception, I think, occur quite often, and they're actually manipulated a lot by artistic and design forms. So it's just one example. This was an installation by Anish Kapoor in London, which is an artist who plays a lot with color, and you're asked to actually position yourself just in front of this huge sort of hole in the wall, which is entirely painted yellow. And as you're exactly in front of this, your whole visual field is yellow. And you're picking very, very subtle cues of depth because, you know, as you see, this is a 3D. But at the same time, because everything is painted in the same color, it sort of feels flat. Now, as you're standing in front of this, you're not thinking, I'm imagining some yellow thing. You're clearly perceiving, you've seen the yellowness. You can talk to someone in that case and say, are you seeing this yellow thing? But as you're seeing this yellow in front of you, there is something strange about the reality of your experience. And it's exactly what the artist has wanted to engineer. It's not talking to your imagination. It's messing up with your perception and your sense of what exactly your perception is presenting. There's definitely something strange here, but that's fine. We go. So hopefully at this stage, I have convinced you that there is an opposite series of cases, which are not the canonical cases where people have been usually looking at, cases where either there is nothing or there is a mix of imagination and perception, and we are confused about them and their reality. But there are cases which are fully marked by this paradoxical signature of being within perception, taken as perceptual, acted upon as clearly perceptual, like the traders, like the sailors who decide to go and check. And yet there is something fishy about the reality of that experience. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk is actually try and look a bit how we get along sort of analyzing what is going on in these cases. And so we are here in a jigsaw. So there is a match with reality. And I want to say that there are two components that we need to posit in this case. There must be a categorical signature that the experience that you're having is perceptual. There must be something which actually tells you this is perception. And on top of that categorical tag of perception, there is some modulation of your feeling of reality that is explaining the fishiness that you're actually experiencing. And this other part is part of your perceptual monitoring that Hakwan was mentioning. But as I will say, we need probably to think about this monitoring itself having at least two types of components. So let's see what that we can say here. So from the previous literature, people would tend to have looked at the other sides, the cases where we are asked to distinguish between imagination and perception. We have a series of distinctions that we can take on board. So what we are looking at here is really, as the topic of the conference, something at the level of your conscious experience, or the fact that your experience feels real. Now, in that sense, this feeling is not reducible to you being able to judge that something is real. So you may, for instance, have cases of depersonalization where the person, their experience doesn't feel real, but they're able to know that it is real. So eventually it's dissociable. You can judge that something is real, although it doesn't feel real. On the other hand, we heard about virtual reality cases, and they are the opposite, showing that it's also dissociable. It could be that you have the perfect virtual reality, where things perfectly feel real, but of course you know, and you can judge that these are not real because you know you're in virtual reality. So the judgment that something is real, the attitude you take cognitively or at a higher order towards your experience, may or may not perfectly line up with that feeling of reality. So we cannot just equate the two. So that's the first distinction. The second distinction that we can take on board is that we cannot reduce the feeling of reality to the confidence we have regarding the content. And in philosophy, that was a very long tradition that dates back to David Hume and people who have tried to look at the difference between imagination and memory. We're always saying, imaginings and memory, when you have them in your head, they feel less vivid. They are less precise. Or they appear in your mind space and not really in the external space. These are all things that are indeed, documented and researched. But what you have to say is that in the same way in which feeling real and being judged as real can dissociate, this kind of resolution of the content and the feeling of reality can also dissociate. You have cases, for instance, of synesthesia where people will report that something is very, very vivid, but having learned that this is part of their, for instance, they see colors when they hear music. So it's very vivid, it's very consistent. It eventually sometimes appears in the objective space, according to the literature on projector synesthesia. It really feels as if there is something floating or the color is on the page, for instance, for people who have color graphing. So it has all the characteristic content-wise of perception, but people still have a possibility to recognize within perception that this is a synesthetic experience. They don't take it as the same behaviorally relevant cue as the rest of their perception. So content and feeling of reality don't always line up in this case. Another case, which is maybe easier for everybody to relate to, is the opposite case of precision being very low, and yet you having no doubt regarding the reality of it. It's blurred vision. Imagine you're wearing glasses and you take your glasses off and you're very, you have very bad vision. The world starts to be really foggy, or you may be looking at the world through a window and it's raining very heavily. You have very, very little precision in your perception. But whatever is going on, so you don't know who you are seeing or how many trees or people there are out there. But you don't think you're imagining these shapes. You think they're still people. You don't know their faces. So here, that's also a case where you can see that the precision that you have regarding your visual experience is not totally correlated to your feeling of reality. These are blurred and yet felt real. So that's another good distinction, because of course we will think about cases where they lined up, but we can think that they are not necessarily the same thing. So where does that leave us? And that's why I put the sort of jigsaw pieces, because when you look at the phenomenon as a whole, of course your judgment, your cognitive expectations, of course the vividness and the precision of your experience will comfort you in your reality sense, your broad sense of this is real. But when you look at the component, we need to think that they're eventually coming apart. And so what we are left with is something that has been proposed actually by Jérôme Dauquiche and Jean-Rémy Martin, two philosophers in Paris. We think that we have actually, along with other aspects of metacognition, during our experience, a form of reality monitoring that is part of metacognition. And again, I really resonated with what Hakwan was saying yesterday when he said that we need not to reduce metacognition to metacognitive confidence. So metacognitive confidence is the kind of thing that we say will tell you, I'm pretty sure I see this person. I'm pretty sure I see the dots moving left and right. So there, your subjective confidence about what you perceive, about the content. But there is another aspect, as we said, it could be blurred vision. You have very low confidence that you saw your friend John, but you're sure that there is someone and that someone is real. So your reality monitoring operates independently of your metacognitive confidence regarding identification and discrimination. It's perfectly consistent to have an experience where you say it feels real, though I'm not sure this is exactly this I'm seeing, right? And so, again, to go back to the example of the rainbow, we have to think about the case along this line, that there is no, there's the idea this is real, but I'm not, sure that I'm getting this right. Okay, so if we have this sense of reality, which is not reducible to the judgment of reality, nor to the precision of your content, what can we say about this metacognitive reality monitoring system? And especially, can it explain the cases that I presented, that is this extraordinary perception, which, as I put again, have this kind of paradoxical double signature of both being taken as clearly perceptual and yet feeling fishy. Well, the problem here is that if you have only one reality monitoring system, how could one system give you these two values of something which is, sums up it's perceptual and so it's fishy, right? So because we have to account for these cases, I've argued that actually what you need is to think about a dual model. There is something that sorts this representation experiences as perceptual in a categorical way, says, stamp it's perceptual. And then on top of this, you have the sense of reality that is being confused. It's not just that this is solving the problem of extraordinary perception. I think that this double model has actually a series of interesting benefits. The first one is that if we think, and when we've dissociated this tag of perception from the metacognitive monitoring, then we can think this is how non-human animals who don't have metacognition actually still have a way to track when it's perceptual or not. Otherwise, if you always think that in order to distinguish reality from internally generated representation, you need something metacognitive, then how do other animals do it? Right. So here we get some room to actually think about these cases. But it can also work, and if you think that, for instance, that the metacognitive part really contributes in a substantial way to your subjective phenomenal experience, for instance, This actually tag of this was real, this reality tag, is something that can eventually also work, although there is no phenomenal experience attached to it. That is, if I present you with something very briefly, you may be left with that feeling that there was something presented. I felt there was something. There was really a visual flash. But I can't tell you more, right? Because I don't have the phenomenal, or maybe memory is not capable of keeping track of that. So again, I think it's very important to have this dual model with this categorical first stage. To say that it is categorical, of course, doesn't mean that it's not accumulating some sort of evidence and drawing on a lot of things that are dynamically going on. But at some point, it gives a stamp. That's just that the output is not like a confidence rating. It's a really clear stamp and tells you this is there was something really out there. Now, what is the other part? And moving to the second metacognitive things that will exist, for instance, in humans like us. Contrary to the Dokish and Martin view, who thinks that there is a single thing, I said not only there is this categorical aspect, but we've kept thinking about the kind of components that we need to put in order to explain this feeling of reality varying within perception. And here are the two types of components that I think we need to realize and to grant to that. The first one is what we have called a causality monitoring sets of processes and mechanisms. This is along the closer in that case to a confidence judgment, something that can be graded, but it's not about the nature of the content, what it is you're perceiving, but just about whether there is something or not. It's a bit like confidence for detection, right? There is something out there causing my perception, but maybe not able to say confidently what it is. Another aspect of that causality monitoring is something that you get from the fact that also you cannot really control what you're experiencing. So in the case where you have a weird feeling of reality, sometimes you feel that you anticipated what you saw. And it's a bit as if you were able to guess, as if you were in control of your perception. And when you have these experiences where, I know that there's this déjà vu and there's a cases that need to be handled very carefully. But when that happens, you also have a kind of extraordinary perception. You're seeing these things, but because you have the feeling that you controlled or you predicted what was going on, then you're both convinced it's perceptual, but it's fishy. And that's also a component that I think explains how things are in the good cases, that because you can't really predict things so perfectly, there is always an element that you're not predicting that gives you the confidence that this is actually caused by the external world. It's a thin balance of you predicting, but not predicting so much that it starts to feel bizarre, as if you're in control of the external world, right? So all of that are systems that are part of your causal monitoring, the relation between your senses and the external world, and contribute to your feeling of reality, either healthily or when things go wrong, explain extraordinary perception. We wrote about how this can explain actually what is going on in the multisensory cases. I think we believe that there is underneath the weirdness of the McGurk and the weirdness of the double flash illusion and all these multisensory cases, the fact that you're not just tracking the sensory precision of each signal, but something about the healthy nature of the causal structure, spatial causal temporal structure of the world. Because it's a bit complicated, I want to turn to something that has attracted our attention in the lab. How long do I have actually? Because I really would like to. How long?
So you have another 25.
Okay, so I'm really fine, great.
I mean, with the question, so it's 15.
Okay, no, that's good. So I want to talk now about actually a series of works that we have done regarding this causality monitoring, and it has to do with the sense of touch. And here is something that, again, starting, maybe this is as a more sort of philosophical aspect of my interest. I often start by observing things and being puzzled, and then I try to move them to the lab and find especially collaborators to engage with this phenomena. But this is something that's puzzled me for a long time. That is, it seems that when things get fishy, exactly like the cases where which I described, people have a very strong tendency to want to touch things. Now, it's exactly a good case of extraordinary perception in the sense that you're not doubting in many cases that there is something out there, but somehow by touching them, it sort of reassures you that they're real. This is famous. So in this case, I'm not saying that Jesus really appeared again and resurrected, but there is this famous anecdote in the Bible that when Jesus reappeared, Thomas, doubting Thomas, seeing Jesus, was not convinced enough that Jesus was there again and insisting in touching him. And touch brought him this final conviction that he was real. So that's the St. Thomas effect. The idea that somehow the causality monitoring that you have through vision is not as convincing as the causality monitoring that you get from the sense of touch. And I was actually talking during the break about the fact that when you look at even cases of, for instance, schizophrenia, you have a lot of hallucination in vision. You have many hallucination also in audition. But auditory and visual largely dominate over tactile. Maybe they haven't been looked for that much, but it seems that, again, there is a very robust reality monitoring in touch, which means that it's less prone to hallucination. It has illusions, it has, we can mess up with the sense of touch, but it has this strong signature of things that are real, like in the St. Thomas effect. And so we reviewed actually in the volume that we put together with Tony in 2018, we reviewed this evidence for the St. Thomas effect, starting from philosophy and psychology, and then we started conducting our own experiments to try and see whether this was really a thing. It seems to be a thing outside the Bible. This is Mike Pence visiting a high security military compound to not touch. I actually went to look at how many objects in museums who have signs written "do not touch" get actually damaged because people touch them. And it's millions. I mean, this is real high impact psychological research. We need to understand why people are compelled to actually touch things that they shouldn't touch. And we're not here talking about, statues and sculptures where there is special powers if you rub special parts of the statues. It's just exactly what is going on. I feel, we have great sets of shots. I've started with my collaborators to have collections of these pictures on the internet, and the number, especially high-level government official touching weapons. When it's written "do not touch," it's very, very amusing. But this one is a good one. This is there. We really have this, right? So interestingly, there is a philosophical sort of tradition behind this. Famously, this is Bishop Berkeley, who was known as a famous idealist, saying that everything is actually just an idea in your mind, and he was talking with his friend Johnson, and Johnson is supposed to have been walking and seen a stone and kicked his foot in the stone very clearly and say, I refute you in this way. Because it really hurts, right? The solidity of the material world shows you that this is not just an idea in your mind. There is something about the sense of touch and the solidity that you get out of this, which is different from the senses, the distal senses like vision and audition. This is known now as an argument by the stone or ad lapidem, when you actually demonstrate your argument. So we tried actually to see whether we would find this type of signature of confidence and sense of robustness of the reality that you get from the sense of touch, contrasting it with other senses and its ongoing work. But this was an early experiment that doesn't fully provide the full argument, but I will still present you with the sort of evidence towards this idea that there is a stronger sense of reality in touch. So in this experiment, participants were presented with what is known as the inverted T illusion. So if you see this inverted T in front of you, you tend to see the longer branch as the branch that is vertical as longer than the one that is horizontal. It's a very nice one because it actually works with touch as well. I invite you to try with your chopsticks. Next lunch break, you put them in a T, and if you put them in front of you and you close your eyes and you rub your finger on them, you will also feel that the one that is going further away from you feels longer than the horizontal one. So we had a series of this inverted T of various lengths, and participants were invited to check them either only visually or by touching them. After each one, they were asked how sure they were in their confidence judgment regarding the following question: is the horizontal bar the same length as the vertical one? Because those sides were varying, people were sometimes right, sometimes wrong, and we had an illusion. But this was a bit the distraction of the task. What we were interested in is really the confidence rating. And here's the strange pattern that we see in the confidence. On the one hand, what we have on the left is how accurate people were in detecting whether the vertical bar was the same as the horizontal one. And you can see here that this is the accuracy and the confidence. The accuracy actually of vision compared to the confidence is always lower. The subjective, this is the objective accuracy because it's an illusion, and the subjective accuracy has the same feature. What you have basically is the case of vision being better, but trusted less than touch. Which, if you have any idea of, the general idea of metacognition, normally your subjective confidence should follow accuracy. Here we have the strange signature that the confidence is not following accuracy. What you have even more, which is surprising, and we have kept on working, is actually this effect that you trust your sense of touch more is higher when you're exactly in the area that are the fishiest. That is the most of the core of the illusion. So you tend to trust your sense of touch even more when things are getting very difficult. In a full series of follow-up experiments, we've seen that if you ask people to check and you give them the opportunity to check multisensory stimuli, which are presented both in vision and in touch, and then you tell them you can check either visually or with touch, they will want to check again with touch whenever things are exactly in the most sort of ambiguous interval. When things are less ambiguous, they say vision, because probably vision is less effortful as well. But we keep having this signature, which is very strange, of trying to rely more on having higher confidence in touch, especially when things are getting fishy. Okay, so that's for causality monitoring. And as I said, there seems to be something here in your sense of materiality and your causal interaction during haptic exploration that is more satisfactory, not for detecting, but for thinking something is real. The second part and the second component of this sense of reality within perception that can explain the strangeness of some extraordinary perception has to do with social coordination. The first component is individual. You can have it alone. The other aspect, which is much discussed in the philosophical literature, is that if something is real, if you perceive it, then other people should perceive it. Objects of perception are public, whereas objects of imaginations are private. And again, we have a lot of clinical instances where these things go wrong, where people imagine things, and although they are private to them, they think everybody can hear them or see them. But not working on clinical populations, we are interested in seeing how actually the presence of others and the feeling that your perception is coordinated with the perception of others contribute to you taking your experience as real, or eventually, when it goes badly, feeling fishy. So there are a lot of studies, on the social effects of social context and perception when you're with others, when you discuss with others, when you exchange your confidence with others. But very few have been looking at this sense in which perceiving things while somebody is also in the room with you contributes to you taking your experience as more real. In many, it's really tricky because, by the way, in many experiments, what we see is that sometimes the experimenter is actually sitting next to the participants, and sometimes they leave the room and then they come back. And if we are right, then this will mess up with a series of effects in perception that should be better controlled. That is, whether there's somebody else staring at the same thing as you changes how you perceive. So I will go quickly at the only one experiment because it has also some brain data. So this is some recent ongoing work with Mustafa Ulkan and Bahadur Barami in Munich. And what we did here was to simply present a very usual task, which is a random motion task, where the dots are presented with different levels of coherence, and the task of the subject is to say whether the dots are moving more to the left or more to the right. And they had to indicate also their confidence in this decision. Because you manipulate the amount of evidence, we heard about it when Akon talk, what you can see is that people become more and more certain that the dots are going in one direction when you give them more evidence that they're going in that direction. The twist here is that it was not just an individual experiment, it was a social experiment. So the screen is divided, there's a cardboard in the middle of the screen. And the stimuli can appear either on the left or on the right. This is for the participant. But what happens is that there is also a confederate who's sitting, it's counterbalanced, either to the left or to the right, and is looking only at one part of the screen in common with the participant. So through this very simple sort of manipulation, what we have here is that one part of these dots are publicly seen, and this other part are privately seen only, right? When they appear on one side or the other. It's a very neat design because what we know is that just having somebody next to you tends to make you more competitive or aroused and so on. And here it's constant across conditions, right? The effects of known as social motivation and social presence are just constant. The only thing that varies is whether the stimuli are presented only to the participant or in common with another participant. And now, what did we find? Well, on the display of the experiment, what is interesting here and sort of leads toward the fact that this is not looking here at your canonical confidence in what you perceive. is that here is the accuracy of the decisions in the public side when it was seen in common, and in the private side when it's only seen by the participant. And the accuracy each dot is a participant is comparable. The confidence rating, how sure you were that the dots were going left and right, is also comparable. So there's no difference in your perceptual performance. I have to say that at this stage, the PhD student was really still expecting that there would be something in the metacognition, was a bit disappointed. Null results, first year of PhD was tough. Reaction times were also the same because we had carefully controlled for the effect of social presence. So there was no more excitement when you were, you were not faster when there was somebody watching or anything, because the other person was always there. But we had EEG and pupillometry recorded as well. I'll just talk about the EEG because we're still looking at the pupillometry side. What we see is that there's a classic effect of the coherence level. So in ERP analysis, we could see that things were working as expected. That is, you had this difference depending on the evidence accumulation was varied by in the central parietal region. You could decode the level of coherence, but there was no effect here at the ERP level of the social or the public or private aspect. What we had to go, and this is like leaving you with the open question, we had to do actually a representation similarity analysis. But here, what we found and what Mustafa and Obil can actually worked on is to see whether using this RSA, they could decode independently of each other the two effects of the conditions that were manipulated. That is, whether something was very coherent or not coherent, or whether something was presented publicly or privately. And here there is a very clear, very significant difference, including in timing. So what you see on the right side is the coherence model. This is the representation, the dissimilarity correlation that you can get from coherence. And the condition is the private versus public. And the moment actually the stimulus, it's really earlier. The moment the stimulus starts to appear either on the left or the right. So the moment you realize you will be alone seeing it, or there will be somebody else, there starts to be something in the brain that can start to be picked up at the whole brain level in this representation analysis. So there is a different signature of public and private perception. This is not joint attention, you're not monitoring the attention of the other closely. And this is not social presence because social presence is always there. This is not metacognition in your confidence either. This is something else which, again, points at the evidence that there is something about sharing that makes our brain respond differently. Okay, so wrapping up on this talk, what I wanted to convince you of, hopefully, is that we have serious cases of confusion between reality and imagination, but we need to look also at other cases where we are confused within perception. We should think here that this is actually something that leads for composite account. There is a categorical tag, I argue, and something else that comes on top and enriches your feeling of reality. And this graded feeling itself may have different components. One which has to do with you monitoring the causal relation between yourself and the world, and the other having to monitor how much you're in sync or congruent with other perceivers around you. An individual one and a social one. So two things to finish. I've focused on that. So can my account and this account sort of explain the classic problem of perception when you actually have some representation which are not clearly tagged as perceptual and maybe they're imaginary? Yes, it can, because it just says that actually in that case is the tagging that is going wrong and not the confused feeling on the top. So I'm happy to respond to more questions about that. But what are the benefits otherwise of this aspects? I think that, as I said, having this idea that there is a categorical mechanism that says sometimes this is real, independently of metacognition, helps with non-human animals. I think this is a much more fine-grained characterization of a lot of clinical breakdowns in the sense of reality that we tend otherwise to think have to do with the, imagination getting in the picture, whereas maybe it's not. It's within perception itself that these clinical breakdowns occur. And it can also open some new hypotheses regarding the developmental side of the sense of reality. So if you have the idea that you have these two metacognitive monitoring, the individual one and the social one, which one comes first in children? Are they more convinced of the reality of things because it's actually shared with others and they coordinate with others? Or are they more sensitive to this individual causality monitoring aspect? So again, we have new questions that we can ask within this framework, and hopefully new questions that you will be asking me just now. And I wanted to thank all my collaborators on this project and the subset of the people at the lab in Munich. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm just wondering if there is some strong relationship between the degree of a sense of reality and a degree of immersiveness. I mean, there might. I just wondering if there are just two sides of one coin, because the multi-dimensions of the sense of reality sounds like kind of similar to what Eaton talked yesterday about the multi-dimension of immersion. Thank you.
I mean, all these constructs tend to be like documented in different aspects of the literature and under different names. So you have like the feeling of presence, the feeling of immersion, the feeling of reality, and so on and so forth. So I think we will need to agree exactly of what kind of immersion. So is it immersion in the virtual environment, for instance, or is it feeling immersed in an aesthetic, installation which is giving you these feelings, and whether you have your sense of reality? Because what I want to say is that really the canonical cases that I'm interested in, which are this extraordinary perception, is where your judgment that this is real is accurate. There is really something out there which is really an object on an event. You're really getting that you're perceiving it, and then there is a fishiness. So maybe immersion is covering more cases than this sense of reality in that respect. But I think they're closely related, absolutely. That's the link between immersion and multisensory congruence is also very high. That's true. Thanks.
No, you have a question.
Okay, so thank you for the wonderful talk. So you mentioned about there's maybe a dissociation of our perception and the feeling of realness of that perception, and I think it has an interesting parallel with the discussion of like sense of agency. So for our action, we also can have we have an objective total control of our action, but we can have no agency or authorship for that action. So I'm thinking because you talk about perception, right? So I'm thinking whether these kind of taxis system or your model can extend to even about our voluntary action. Because right now our the dominant theory of sense of agency one is focused on the theory with the motor system, but I think your talk. Yeah.
So I think that's true. Like again, in the same way, and this is a big picture talk. So I was trying to simplify and get a lot of details. But basically, what you have in the sense of agency in any action that you perform, as simple as pressing a button, you have some tactile feedback, right? So there is touch, there is bodily awareness, there is the sense of proprioception, there is a sense of movement and your muscles contracting, and then there is a sense of intentionally intending that movement. And so it's true that the components that are part of the the tactile feedback and the bodily awareness and the sense of movement, they actually could be also manipulated and made less real. They're actually this wonderful illusions where you make people, you know, press a button. Actually, the Mac thing is like that. You feel you're pressing, but you're not pressing. You know that, right? It's only laterally vibrating like that. The idea that you're clicking is just an illusion. Otherwise, it would make noise. And Steve Jobs didn't want noise. So this is actually one of the most sort of everyday illusion that you have a sense, at least, but here you're misrepresenting the kind of action that you're doing, but that's not, but definitely, now that I've told you, try your Mac and feel what your sense of reality is for pressing your button. But when you will get into this aspect, and I think we really need to be really clear about where in the sense of agency, what aspects are, you know, like this jigsaw thing, which are contributing to your feeling that you've really acted on the world. And these are important components, absolutely. Thank you for the question.
A really wonderful, thought-provoking talk. The question I have is, how much of the sort of the typical reality monitoring process that goes on, how much of it is unconscious versus how much of it is conscious? Because I think, I don't know, 99% of the time, you know, I think it happens all unconsciously. But in some of the examples that you used, it sounded like there was sort of conscious metacognitive processes going on in order to determine, you know, is this real or is it not? What's your thoughts?
So yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I think that's what I call the tag aspect, the categorical. I think this is just, you know, not only it's not conscious, it's not consciously accessible. Next, no, you know, this is independent of consciousness wholly. What is going on the top? There are two possibilities. As I said, you know, you can attend to it and sort of describe it, and most of the time we attend to it when things go wrong. Right? It's a bit like your vestibular system. It's, you know, you can get seasick and then you really feel, or you go on a roller coaster and you really feel that, but otherwise you don't feel it. The question is that, is it not conscious, or is it because you're so habituated that actually you don't know, it's in the background? And you know, it's very difficult to actually distinguish this two in the laboratory context, because in the laboratory context, we will make people engage with, you know, we'll draw their attention and things. So these are questions more for phenomenology. I think that's to really try and think about how these two accounts really differ. But I would agree. I don't know what Hakon would say about the feeling of confidence, not in this kind of reflective way we prompted in the lab, like how sure were you? But as you go around the world, just, you know, you have this certainty or uncertainty, which is modulated. Does it sometimes go fully unconscious, or it's just there as a kind of constant background? It's a tricky question. I cannot take a stance on that, but there is a part that can be going on, the tag part, unconsciously.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up here. Let's thank Ophelia again.